My name is Bob Edwards, and I lead women's health for the UPMC enterprise. As a major healthcare system, UPMC is a very large, multifaceted organization. As you have seen over the last 2 days, women's health is a central focus throughout our system, from scientific discovery and clinical care to community medicine and innovation. Not only do we have a research institute with a branch campus in Erie, we have 17 obstetric hospitals, and I have physician providers that report to me across the western central part of the state of Pennsylvania, numbering over 190 physicians. Our Department of OB/GYN faculty, the Magee-Womens Research Institute, and Magee-Womens Hospital are the driving forces for these initiatives. Health equity was the opening session of our summit, and it focused on critical needs to accelerate initiatives in health equity. We know very much that true progress in women's health cannot be made until we address the disparities and racial inequities in healthcare. And as you saw on Tuesday afternoon, we are very committed to engage our community and use every lever we can to improve those outcomes. We convene national thought leaders and community-based organizations for a dialogue about practical ways we can move this health equity agenda forward, together with the communities that are most impacted. I know firsthand that families who are economically disadvantaged face adversity on many fronts. My parents were divorced when I was 6 years old, and you would definitely have called me a lower socioeconomic class growing up. My grandmother raised me with very limited resources. She had a pension fund from a factory job she had for 40 years and a small Social Security payment. There are often serious concerns about financial burdens that would come into the daily decisions she made about how she would use her meager funds. I saw her delay care for years for fear of financial burden and disability. As we start this clinical session, we've heard about new and exciting breakthroughs that are just around the corner, but I really wanted this session to focus on practical, deliverable components. It may take years for some of these initiatives to come to the clinic. The financial impact of adding these new technologies cannot be discounted, particularly on patients. And interpreting and understanding how to use these technologies by the clinicians who care for patients is probably the most important consideration in how these technologies get applied. We have a great group this afternoon, world-class leaders. Robert Green is a global leader in medical genetics, and he will join us virtually from Harvard. C.C. Conley is a prominent voice in U.S. healthcare who will lead us on a conversation about telehealth and digital engagement in 2025. We have very much in my department invested in digital health in a major way, and you're going to hear from some of our folks in our department this afternoon as well about how we use telehealth. Cheryl Kingsbury and Rebecca Thurston both are global leaders in women's health research and will provide perspectives on menopause and sexual health. And Michelle Williams, the Dean of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, will be joining us virtually. She is a global thought leader who most recently has powerfully garnered attention about how this pandemic has brought the long-standing health equities into focus for our country. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce David Ewing Duncan, who will introduce our first topic, the path to preventive genomics. David will also moderate the panel discussion following Robert Green's keynote. David Duncan is a renowned American journalist and author with special emphasis on discoveries, technology, and the impacts in the life sciences. You've probably read his work in the New York Times, Vanity Fair, and The Atlantic, and many other major news outlets. David also writes about robots, artificial intelligence. He's a best-selling author, and most exciting, he just finished his latest book, which he co-authored with the biotech visionary Craig Venter, who mapped the first human genome. Please join me in welcoming David to the stage.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to be at a live meeting with real people. So we have a session coming up here that I'm very excited about. And as a journalist, I've been covering this beat, if you will, for over 20 years, genomics. And the promise of predictive genomics has been with us that whole time, but it's now actually on the cusp, I think, of really happening, and in many cases is. And one of the real luminaries, as Bob mentioned, in this field is Robert Green, and he's also a personal friend of mine, and been working with him off and on for many years. He's a professor of medicine and a geneticist at Harvard Medical School, and he's the director of the Genomes to People Research Program. He's also one of the people I call missing links, who devoted themselves for years to connecting the worlds of physicians, patients, and researchers to truly deploy the predictive power of genomics. And by the way, this is a guy who is relentless in going after your DNA. So if he was here, he would be recruiting all of you. I even actually went to a spit party with supermodels in New York City during the Fashion Week there. That's how this guy is moving around the world, trying to collect as many samples as possible, and even more important, to make sense of them. So I hope Robert is with us. There he is.
So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person. Had a family issue here at home, which is fine, but needs my attention. But I'm delighted to be here and speak to you today, and honored to be a part of this keynote. So thank you for the inviters, and thank you for allowing me to present virtually. I'm going to share my screen now and talk a little bit about the path to preventive genomics. So I am a physician scientist at Harvard Medical School, and I work in the area of implementation science. And I wanted to disclose my funders and the advisory roles that I play, as well as the company, Genome Medical, that I've co-founded. So I think you all know that preventive genomics is the notion that you can use your DNA to predict and prevent future disease. It's kind of been a dream of the Human Genome Project from the very beginning. And remarkably, it hasn't been very well fulfilled, at least not on a population level. We've made extraordinary progress in certain specific areas. But you don't go to your doctor today and your doctor says, hey, why haven't you gotten your genome sequenced? And let's get your genome sequenced so that we can keep your health up. And yet that's where we all think we're going. And the question is, how do we get there? And the work that we do has been really tackling the issues that are preventing us from getting there. And I've summarized them on this slide as the conditions are too rare. Nobody wants to learn about them. There's too much information. When you do get the information, it's toxic. The participants or patients or their providers are going to misunderstand and do something bad with it. There is tremendous privacy concerns, some of which are justified, and some of which are probably exaggerated, and in an overweening sense that this is not cost effective, and ultimately that it's not actionable. And I would like to propose to you today that every single one of these presuppositions is incorrect. And the challenge of my career over the last few years has been demonstrating with empirical evidence that they are incorrect, and that genomic information is both actionable and, if not immediately cost effective, well on the path to being cost effective. Let me share with you some of what we've done. So my team is rather small. It's sort of a core team. We do implementation research, which means we focus on the benefits, the risks, and the costs. And to do this, we collaborate with many, many people, over 300 people. And if you were to boil down the debate about population screening with genomics to sort of two little cartoon figures arguing with each other, I think you would boil it down to this. On the one side, it is wonderful if you can know ahead of time that you are at risk for a suspected genetic cause of cancer, heart disease, or some other illness. It's also would be great if you could risk stratify on the basis of that and get better surveillance and prevention, whether that's monogenic or polygenic type things. And frankly, the whole zeitgeist of medical information is changing. As David Duncan, with his pioneering book, showed us a few years ago, people want to know about themselves. And the people who are maybe out there, eccentric self-quantifiers today are becoming more and more mainstream. On the other side, even if you got the variant calling and the variant classification perfectly correct, which is a big if, you would find a lot of people with legitimate mutations or legitimate increased risk who were never going to get the condition that they were at risk for. That penetrance could be very low. Especially with rare conditions, that means there's a very low prior probability. So you could end up identifying many more people at risk who don't actually ultimately manifest the condition. And as we mentioned in that earlier slide, there is really unproven value in terms of cost effectiveness and medical utility, although I think that's changing from a lot of directions. And a very big issue, and really the reason when I announced my disclosures that I co-founded Genomics 5 years ago, is that there really is this hard obstacle in the medical workforce where clinicians are not incentivized to take the time to learn about a whole new discipline, and there simply aren't enough geneticists and genetic counselors running around to handle the volume that would be implied if you do some sort of population screening. So to try to address some of these questions, we've done a lot of work over the years, including a lot of work in return of research results that I'm not going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about 2 trials. The first one is called the MedSeq project, and this was the world's first pilot randomized trial of comprehensive genome sequencing in healthy individuals. Now, you can tell from my voice I'm enthusiastic about this. Why did we need a randomized trial? And therein lies part of the conundrum. This world is divided into believers and skeptics, and it's very little ground in between for those at equipoise. So as a clinical trialist, I tried to assume a position of equipoise here and actually randomize people who wanted to get sequencing into an arm that did not get it and an arm that got it, with comprehensive interpretation of over 5,000 genes, and then follow the medical, behavioral, and economic outcomes, including medical record review, patient interviews, validated scales, and so forth. Very elaborate project. Even at the beginning, simply deciding how we were going to filter and select from the 5 million variants that each of them is carrying around, which ones we were going to report. And over the course of this study, there's been much more consolidation of standards, such that the ACMG, for example, has standards for variant curation that are now getting better and better and more standardized. And we have ClinVar as a kind of encyclopedia of accepted variants. So this is getting better and better, but we were among the first to try to improve this workflow. And then we were also the first to try to boil all this down into a single page report that a primary care doc could understand. Now, this isn't very fancy. It's no dashboard. It doesn't have bells and whistles. It's got some esoteric language on it, but we managed to put all the important information from your entire whole genome on one page. And then with about 6 hours of training, we trained up primary care doctors to feel comfortable reading this, interpreting it, and talking to their patients about it. We didn't use genetic counselors and geneticists in this entire study, except as a kind of ultimate safety net if someone wanted to call us. And guess what? They really didn't call us. And we found stuff. These were ostensibly healthy people, so these were completely unanticipated monogenic findings, and we found them in 20% of middle-aged, healthy adults. Think about that. However many of you there are sitting in that room, presumably with your masks on, I can't see you, that 20% of you are walking around with a monogenic disease risk that you don't know about. And when we circled back to those patients, we found that about a quarter of those were actually manifesting clinical or subclinical features of the disease in question. They already had features of it. It just hadn't been noticed or recognized, or it had been misdiagnosed. So that's pretty mind-blowing. And it means there could be a lot more genetic disease. If you think about this over the next 20 years, this is one moment in time, so many of these will be manifesting. We also checked to see if we had made a horrible mistake in allowing the primary care doctors to talk about this with their patients. We actually audio taped and scored, transcribed and scored every conversation that the primary care docs had with their patients on these issues and tracked their notes in real time in the medical record. And crossing our fingers, they did very, very well in terms of a minimum number of errors, and those were not what we consider to be high-risk errors. We also went into the medical record, interviewed patients and their families, and tracked as best we could healthcare spending. This is, of course, of critical importance to try to understand the value. You're not going to save money with this in the short run, but the question is, do you get some medical benefit for appropriate cost and you have value? And we found that, of course, you spend more money when you get these genomes sequenced and when you follow up on the results. But it wasn't as much more as people sometimes thought. Now, look, if you think this is promising, if you think, wow, there could be room here for anticipatory genetic testing in adults, then I got to bridge the cell to you. Now, then think about how much more salient this could be to newborn babies. And indeed, this is something that's been talked about for 20, 30 years. This just happened to be a quote from 2012 with Francis Collins saying, this is the sequencing of newborns. It's going to happen. Same idea, same kind of randomized clinical trial. By the way, these are volunteer families, and they are not pleased when they find themselves in the placebo arm. This time, instead of 5,000 genes, we restricted ourselves to genes that would be most salient in childhood and adolescence. We got down to 1,000 genes. Very interesting. It turns out that everybody says they want this, but when they've actually had their baby and you walk into the newborn delivery room and offer them and tell them you want to stick their baby again for some more blood, a lot of them say no, not on the basis of genetics, just because they don't want their baby stuck. But when you do sit down with them, explain the study to them, 2/3 of them said yes. And again, with a smaller gene list, going from 5,000 genes to 1,000 genes, we still find unanticipated monogenic findings in 11% of these newborn babies. And once again, about a quarter of them, when you go and examine them with whatever is the appropriate examination afterwards, they have something there. So for example, this biotinidase deficiency child had a pretty severe partial biotinidase deficiency. We don't know. They made it through newborn screening, but it was clearly abnormal enzyme levels. So this baby's taking a vitamin every day of her life, doing extremely well. This elastin mutation, which is associated with supravalvular aortic stenosis, is something that you would typically see all sorts of symptomatology. This is an absolutely normal baby, normal heart sounds. But this elastin mutation, when we did an echocardiogram on this baby absolutely had a mild but abnormally narrowed aorta. Now, this is a glass half full, glass half empty scenario. You could say, oh, you wasted all that time doing the genetics and the echocardiogram, and you see that baby's not having any symptomatology. So you just wasted time and money. Or you could say, if that baby starts to have fainting spells on the playground, we know where we're going to look first. So it's a really interesting psychological trade-off in terms of the value of some of this predictive information. When you do look at a large number of genes, by the way, you also find a lot more recessive gene variants, which may not be salient to this baby's health, but the parents like knowing that, and sometimes they go and test each other for preconception screening for their next baby. Many people, there's been an enormous narrative of psychological distress with genomics. And we've put this to rest in numerous different studies. But here again, the randomized trial methodology gives you a very strong and rigorous methodology to look at validated scales of depression, self-blame, anxiety, and parent-child disruption. And as you can see at a glance here, there's no difference between the families that didn't get sequencing, the families that got sequencing, and the subset of families in which they found a monogenic disease risk. So this is obviously due to self-selection, but that's the dynamic here. We're not going to force this on anybody. It's really about people having the option to find out these things if they want the option. Finally, healthcare spending even lower, and we can use those numbers to create models that go out and predict cost benefit, and we can watch those models come into focus as the predicted cost of sequencing and interpretation comes lower and lower and lower. So we've done this for some subsets. For example, this is just the subset of pediatric cancer predisposition, and we're able to show with some really good rigor that this alone will probably be cost effective within the next few years. So where do we go with this? Well, rare genetic diseases are not actually rare in the aggregate. 1 in 135 babies is born with a genetic condition that has a treatment in childhood. Some of those are picked up on the recommended uniform screening panel that the states use for their heel stick, but many of them are not. And that whole process of getting onto that panel can take 10 or 11 years. Whereas in real time, gene-targeted therapies are coming out every month to treat more and more of these rare conditions. So is it possible that we should be thinking about sequencing newborn babies? And my answer is yes. We should be thinking about this. We must be thinking about this. We must be entering this life cycle. We've tried entering it as adults. It doesn't work as well. Maybe we can enter this lifelong genomic health life cycle with newborns, following babies, unlocking the genome when it's needed for preconception screening, for polygenic risk, for pregnancy itself, into middle age and old age. And maybe this is an opportunity to get on board with the lifelong genomic health that I think many of us have been dreaming about and is yet still not come to pass. For our part, we are working hard in this research arena. It's very difficult to do these studies. There's a lot of bias against doing these studies out there. And they're hard to recruit. They're hard to pull off, but we're doing it. And there's a few other groups in the world that are also thinking about doing it. So we're going to try to organize an international newborn sequencing consortium and grow these numbers from the less than 1,000 that our 10 years of NIH funding is allowing us to do to tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. Finally, I'd like to end up just reminding you how much value is in the genome. And partly, I think we don't realize this value because we've been segmented and siloed, with recessive conditions being the purview of reproductive medicine, and pharmacogenomics being in that niche, and dominant mutations being with pediatricians, and polygenic risk being with computational docs, first getting a bad reputation with direct-to-consumer and now being rehabilitated as they get better and better technologies. And yet, again, assuming this is going out as it should be, all of you who are listening to this, this is what we think, based on our research over the last 10 years, is what you're carrying in your genome. And by 50%, we mean 50% of you have 2.5 times the risk of the rest in terms of one of 6 polygenic risk conditions: cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, atrial fibrillation, ordinary breast and prostate cancer, and colon cancer. So with that, I'm going to thank the many, many people that I regularly collaborate with. It's one of the joys of academics, is that you get to collaborate with so many brilliant and important people. None of this that I'm telling you about has been done alone. And I really want to thank you for your attention and for inviting me. Again, I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but really looking forward to being the big head on the screen over the stage, if that's the way you have it set up. I would encourage you to follow our program on Twitter and Instagram. And if there are people out there who are interested in trainee opportunities, or if you are interested in having yourself sequenced in a confidential manner, we have one of the only clinics in the company that's doing comprehensive sequencing of healthy individuals. It is out of pocket, but we are doing it to the highest standards. So I'll stop there and thank you again for your attention.
Thank you, Robert. That was fascinating as always. I met Robert, we can't quite remember the year, it was probably around 2008, when there wasn't all of that research that he'd done, and he was just starting to study why people were resistant to finding out if Alzheimer's ran in their family, if they too had propensity for Alzheimer's. And it's obviously expanded a great deal. And by the way, there are a lot more people now willing to do that than there were then, so there is progress being made. But Robert, I did have a question. And by the way, one of the most impressive slides there may be one that you wouldn't expect me to focus on, but all of the people working on your project. How extraordinary. And it really does, it doesn't take a village, it takes a planet to really get this underway. But talk to me a little bit, Robert, about the resistance. So by the way, if my panelists are floating around out there, come on up and have a seat, and I'll join you in a second. But I'm wondering about this resistance of parents, others in the BabySeq project, and how you answer that. And are there there are real fears there, right? I mean, how will this data be used in the future? And you're doing this for obviously a newborn who can't have a choice in the matter. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, thanks, David. There are real fears, and I don't mean to be cavalier about them at all. If you learn that you're at risk for an inherited condition, particularly one that's inevitable, like Huntington's disease, that's terrifying. But most genetics isn't like that. We had the unfortunate history of having Huntington's disease be one of the first we could test for. Most inherited information, even for something like BRCA or colon cancer, is a probabilistic. And humans do much better with that. So the narrative of catastrophic distress, we and others have pushed back on. The second narrative is privacy. And that's endemic to our society right now with Facebook and all of the tech companies. The notion that this is private information and that people will get hold of it and use it to harm you or disadvantage you, particularly the notion that you might have to report it to an insurance company or suffer some sort of discrimination. Again, there is a potential truth to that. The federal law covers many types of things, but does not protect you from life insurance underwriting on the basis of this. On the other hand, it hasn't been used very much. And what we forget on the balance of that equation is the potential life-saving benefit. And in addition, there are states like Florida who are passing laws, really good laws, that fully protect people, finally, after many, many years. And third, David, there's the true reason to be skeptical, which is rigorously demonstrating clinical utility and cost effectiveness. And that is just really hard because the benefits of genome, intuitively you believe it, but the benefits accrue over not a year, not 5 years, but probably decades. And it's very hard to truly demonstrate that to the degree that the United States Preventive Services Task Force would like to see. Those are some of my answers.
Okay, well, thank you, Robert. And so we've got about 45 minutes here to talk about this topic, and it's like a lot of other topics being discussed here at the meeting, we could use a lot longer to really dig into this. But we have an amazing panel. You've met Robert. I did want to give just a wee bit of background. And the reason I'm sitting here, I do cover this field, but I also am a participant. And it's hard to believe, 20 years ago, almost to the month here, I was one of the first humans to be genetically sequenced, and obviously not a complete genome by any stretch of the imagination, because that was millions, tens of millions of dollars 20 years ago. But I was tested. I was given an assignment at Wired Magazine to write about the Human Genome Project. And almost nobody knew about genomics then, outside of a few specialists and researchers. And I looked at it, I said, oh my God, there are 4 letters here, and I don't know, there are a few markers that have been identified. How am I going to make this interesting? So I got this crazy idea to get myself tested, to be genetically sequenced. And I found out at that time, especially, just how hard that was. There was no 23andMe, there was no Illumina. Most of the sequencing technologies that are now pretty routine did not exist. So I did get a company in San Diego, and they tested me for several hundred markers. And I did get back some interesting data. And I wrote the story, and we thought at Wired, wow, what a gimmick, should we even do this? We're serious journalists. But it really took off because I was able to humanize the story. I was able to write about, for the first time really, what it was like for a human being to have these secrets that are buried inside of us, in our cells, revealed to me. And I shared that, and that was part of what's behind my question to Robert about the privacy issues. My kids later on, as they grew up and they knew that my genome it's actually sitting on a website, the entire genome, they're like, well, Dad, I'm not quite sure about that, since we inherited some of these genes. But from a predictive standpoint, I had a number of results, and these, especially 20 years ago, were not that fabulous, in terms of the power, of the predictive nature of these markers. But I did get, I tested positive for a marker for hypertension, which I have a little bit now. I'm starting to move into that, unfortunately, although it's stress-induced hypertension, which is a specific gene, which, so I fluctuate. But there was maybe some truth in that prediction. I'm having a little bit of hearing issues, which is genetic, which runs in my family. And that was predicted back then. So, this was very loosey-goosey back in those days. But, I'm sitting here continuing to be, or really participate in this project, which I called Experimental Man, and Robert was nice enough to mention that. And there was a book that came out on this with my results of getting massive health tests. I ended up, after that sequencing and the Wired story, getting literally thousands of tests and kind of test driving a lot of the new technologies and testing, as a healthy person, by the way. I did have a rule, take no risk for me. So anyway, let's jump in here. We've heard from Robert, but let's start at the other end with Nathan. And I would love for you guys to just tell us a little bit about yourselves and what you're doing, and how you come to be on this panel about preventing genomics. So Nathan Price.
Yeah, happy to do that. So I'm Nathan Price. I have been, for the last 10 years, a professor and associate director at the Institute for Systems Biology. For the last 4 years, co-ran a group with Lee Hood, and have been really focused on genetics and its manifestation, multi-omics, and how you can use this to put forth what we call scientific wellness. With Lee, co-founded a company called Aravale, where we took about 5,000 people through this, have written a whole bunch of papers that I'm sure we'll reference to some degree in this discussion, really trying to find discoveries. And then about a year ago, I moved from ISB to become CEO of a startup company called Longevity, which was co-founded by a good friend of mine, Joel Dudley, as well as Chris Mason at Cornell. And then we merged that in with a company called Thorn Health Tech, which we took public a couple months ago, and that's really about trying to make personalized scientific wellness a reality in the world and trying to take a lot of the science we've done and push it forward.
That's great. By the way, I miss Aravale.
Me too.
I had yeah, I know. I'm sure you do. No, I had every company test me, and yours actually had that interface, the kind of human interface that I think really made the data make sense to me.
Had a good team there.
So hopefully we will maybe Longevity.
We'll be pulling some of it back. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, and that's a whole other side of the story, by the way, is the economics of trying to start companies around this. So, Philip Empey.
Hi everyone. I'm Philip Empey. I'm an associate professor in the School of Pharmacy here at the University of Pittsburgh, and I direct the Pharmacogenomics Center of Excellence here at UPMC and University of Pittsburgh. So my passion, you heard a little bit about it at the end of Robert's talk, is in pharmacogenomics. I would be willing to bet the majority of the audience either personally or know someone who has to visit a pharmacy and select a medication, and the numbers that he showed at the end of that slide deck is really what drives our passion. Here in Pittsburgh, we have a very large implementation program. We are in the middle of enrolling 150,000 people here to do a large population study that show the value, as was mentioned about this, and making changes in our health system to make sure we can realize that value. So we're excited to see how this impacts better prescribing. You know, the data suggests that about half of us that start a medication don't get the response we're looking for, and we think we can do a lot better for some medications, not all, of course, but many medications that are pretty commonly used. So I do expect, whether it's in the newborn level or folks that are entering the hospital for the first time, or maybe a new insurer plan, employer health programs, wellness programs, that you will see more of this, either from a direct-to-consumer company, or I bet the next time you're at a new visit to the hospital, or perhaps visiting your local pharmacist.
So Svetlana, Yusinka?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor, actually, to be over here and listen from the multidisciplinary experts and at this summit, because this is definitely stimulating different thoughts and the discoveries. So I am the associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine at the Department of the Pathology and Obstetric and Gynecology, and I'm also the researcher at the Magee-Womens Research Institute. I am the director of the cytogenetics and genomics laboratories at the UPMC Medical Center. And my research interest includes the basic research and, more importantly, translational research and genetics area in the reproductive, particularly in the fetal health, how the genetics, genomics, cytogenetics, chromosomal abnormalities impact not only the fetal development, but overall reproductive health. And not only reproductive health, it's also moved toward the general different areas of the health. So we learned a lot about the different genomic conditions, and one of my goals also translate that to the clinical diagnostic services, able to detect that, able to prevent that in the future.
Fantastic. And looking at your bio, you work a lot with the X chromosome.
I do work
Maybe
a lot.
A little bit with the Y?
Well, we do work with the both, and X and Y chromosomes, and there's always a balance, and there's always importance. And X chromosome is just fascinating chromosome by the biology. It's a very different from the biological standpoint, and we don't know how much we actually transmitting by the X chromosome in the genomics, so it's a very important.
No, fantastic. So let me start the conversation here, and by the way, I want people to jump in towards the end in 20 minutes or so from the audience, because we would love to hear from you. Paint a picture for me, if you will, of where you would like to see us sometime in the near future. With preventive genomics, what would that look like? And feel free to be as expansive as you like. I mean, because it's such a complicated question. Partly there's resistance from, the medical community, traditional medicine. There's resistance from how we pay for medicine. But I would love to hear, you guys are in the thick of this. And each of you, by the way, I love this, has a little bit different focus. And so this is a really nicely put together panel, but I don't know who wants to jump in with that, but you can even walk me into a doctor's office. What would that be like? And, if in fact all of your visions came to pass. I don't know who would like to start here. You want to start, Nathan?
I'm certainly happy to start. And I love all the things that Robert talked about, and it's kind of maybe intimidated to start. Robert's maybe the world expert on genomics in the wellness space. What we have done is, and what I see us going forward, is if you look at the genome and how you can use it to interpret other data. So, I very much believe, like Robert brought up today, the genome is a very useful thing for people to know just in general. So I'd love to see that become pretty ubiquitous. A second element of that, and I'll refer back to a paper we did, we were looking at people who were trying to control their cholesterol as they were going through the scientific wellness program. And when they did it, it turned out that you could predict in advance who would be able to do that and who wouldn't based on genetics. And it's based on the difference between the level that you're predicted by genetics and your actual level. So if you have high LDL cholesterol, which is treated exactly the same in the healthcare system today, then it matters if you're there because your genome predicted, which makes it very hard to lower by lifestyle. Or if you have a gap, then you can lower it very easily. So immediately you can imagine that you can take a genome, you can generate all of the polygenic risk scores, the single risk scores, you can map all clinical measures, and it will matter for some and not others, but you can map it to every single one of those. And you can immediately give a person a map to a ROI on your health effort. Because as soon as you do that, you can say, here are all the areas where you have gaps, where your genome, your biology is going to work with you rather than against you. Here are all the things that you can change the most easily that will have the biggest bang for your buck, and you can read that from the genome, but we don't do that today. So that's one of the things in the future I'd really like to see in place.
Yeah. Any other comments?
I'll add on to that, and you gave us the floor to sort of imagine the future and sort of all possibilities. So I'll take you up on that, particularly in the value equation. You know, you can imagine, say I'm a patient, just left my primary care office with a new prescription for an antidepressant. You know, something that we know pretty strongly that the likelihood of getting that right the first time is about a third. You know, so that means I'm faced with knowing that I'm going to likely have to iterate, change dose, change medication even, perhaps not get the improvement I seek for months, because we make these changes once every few months. Instead, I hope what we'll see is the question about, do you have any allergies to any medications? Have you gone through genetic testing in the past? And I think that second question should or could trigger either testing immediately in some situations, or at least the recognition when data exists. So one of the things I think it's hard for folks to realize as a healthcare profession is it's actually more accepted in some ways among patients than it actually is among the health system. If you just look at numbers from direct-to-consumer companies, you know, we're at the 10 to 15% of Americans have gone through some degree of genetic testing just on their own. Maybe it was a fun thing for a Christmas present. But we do research on sort of asking what their expectations are. And a lot of times the expectations are that, well, you're doing this too. In many cases, we're not. So I'd like to think that that test is available if the data are not already available. And then as the patient moves through the system, our physicians, our pharmacists, and our local pharmacies are using the data. It flows with them. And importantly, we're able to make better decisions. So I actually don't think we're that far off from that. I mean, I mentioned the study we're doing here. That data will flow with you anywhere you're in our system here. And we'll have decision support available to help any provider anywhere within the system be able to understand and respond to the dosing recommendations. So I don't think we're that far off, but I think there's some pieces to figure out. There's some, how do we support the primary care docs? The study that Robert did was critically important. Like his, we don't get the questions when we put it out there. We have a whole system set up that you can call us. I mean, we've tested north of 4,000 patients here in the last few years and only had a handful of calls. So I actually think it's not these barriers that are out there that are holding us back. In many ways are just because we either don't have a champion to push it through, there's some fear in the system about how we understand all these moving pieces, or that we haven't done the value-based assessments on the end round to sort of force it through.
Just a quick question to follow up on that, because it's fascinating, because there has been so much work done on pharmacogenomics, but how often do physicians actually ask for that or know about it? I mean, I know several tests that are rarely done, but they can tell you if you metabolize a drug.
Yeah. No, it's rare. I mean, I don't expect even in our forward-thinking clinics that it's a common ask. But I think the world's changing, and I actually think in our particular system, I think the first introduction to many of these providers will actually be the alert that tries to stop them from ordering a medication. So we try to think, like many of the guideline writers, not about whether we should order the test, but what to do with the data, because increasingly the data is going to be available. And I expect the tide will change quickly from projects that are sequencing newborns or monogenic diseases or big initiatives within employer health programs, that increasingly it's going to be there.
Yeah.
So for that reason, I think the education is absolutely critical, so that we're not waiting for a new test to come out and then do new training and then that cycle that's too slow, but let's prepare a workforce in advance. And increasingly the curriculum standards for medicine, for pharmacy, for nursing, actually all embrace this. It's just a matter of getting that first transition thing to happen. And I think you'll start to see folks investing when these value equations come out.
So Svetlana, what do you see as kind of in your imaginary world, what you're working on should look like?
So the genome project was completed in 2003. So we already almost 20 years here have the idea about the sequencing and implications. And it's used to directly probably relate to the birth defects and maybe congenital anomalies. But now we learned over these years, this is not only about the birth defects. There's a lot of the health implications to that. And I think, like Dr. Green outlined, there's a lot of stereotypes about the fear of the data, about the unacceptable kind of unaccepting these technologies because you don't know what to do with those. So I think, like Phil actually outlined, education is one of the biggest probably goals for all of us, for the medical professionals. And it's not only those who are involved in the genetic field, but in every aspect of the medicine. I work a lot with the students, the medical students, the college students, high school students, the clinicians, and I see this gap of the knowledge everywhere. And probably starting from the high school students, college students, is even more visible to introduce that as the part of their education. So later on, when some of them even becoming the healthcare professionals, they do not afraid to look at this data, do not afraid actually to talk about this and implement that in their practice. I think this is what I'm looking for, the open and very comprehensive education in this area that would help move this toward just the knowledge, from the knowledge to the usage of this knowledge in the medical care.
Okay. So Robert, you've given us a little bit of your vision, but I'm wondering, so, I'm a baby in the BabySeq project. And my parents have been in that tiny percentage that actually, allowed me to get tested. What would I expect when I'm, 25 or 30, or, you can pick an age. What will that mean for me?
Well, first of all, you put your finger on one of the sensitivities, because in a child, the parent makes the decision for the child.
Yeah.
When the child turns 11 or 12 and pediatricians start to try to invoke something called assent, where the parent still makes the decision, but the child has the say. And then at 18, of course, they become an adult. And then at 18, strictly in the medical system, the parent doesn't have any right to their medical record or information or decision making. So one of the objections to sequencing babies is that parents are making these decisions about information that will now be in the family that the baby would not have made for themselves when he or she grew up to be of age, particularly adult onset conditions. So I'll just pose it to the panel and the audience. If you had a baby, would you look for a BRCA1 mutation in the baby? And if you found it or inadvertently found it, would you tell the family? And because we had that situation. We had a baby in whom we found the BRCA1. It was not in our protocol to return to adult onset conditions, but we also found out the mother was carrying and she did not know it. So we have a whole paper on that, but the good news is that we found a way to tell her. But this is, David, doing babies is going to be extremely sensitive. If commercial operations do babies, which there are several that are going to be launching in the next few months, there will be be very great in how they frame the value proposition. Do you manipulate and scare parents unnecessarily in order to try to get them to buy something? Or are you really talking about the limited but real value proposition of a newborn sequence? So I don't know, that's more rambling than answer of your question, but it's so interesting.
Well, I was trying to push you into the future on creating the rosiest scenario of how your research will play out. But I think we are in the here and now.
I will tell you, I think we've got to get to the point where every baby is offered newborn sequencing. And if they don't get it as a baby, every child and adult is offered to get it whenever in their life they get it. And by the way, we're going to go through, as Nathan said, we're going to go through the same agony with every layer of multi-omics, metabolomics, proteomics, microbiomics. Each time we're going to come up against the limits of clinical utility evidence. There's going to be companies pushing people to adopt it, public health experts saying slow things down. So this is a dynamic I think is going to play out over and over again as new technologies evolve.
Well, you actually stole my thunder a little bit for my next question, but which is something I've been threatening to write a piece, and I haven't had time to do it for Wired, but it's called Beyond Genomics. And in some of my talks before the pandemic, I was talking about, I put up a slide that said, genomics is so ... yesterday. And not that it's not important, because it's very important, but this idea of multi-omics, and Nathan, that's what Araval was about, and I think longevity is also about. And tell me, I would love to hear from each of you. I mean, Robert's already given us a little bit, what he's thinking about this, but how do we transition? And by the way, what we mean by multi-omics, I'm sure most of you all know, but this is all of the different omics that Robert mentioned and many more. I mean, the microbiome, the metabolome, the epigenome, on and on. And there is some fascinating activity happening out there, both in commercial space and in a lot of labs, of now trying to link together all of these different molecular systems and how we measure them and the data we collect. And you have to sit back for a second and just realize how unbelievably complicated this is. I mean, the genome is, we know that, there may be some subtle changes that happen over a lifetime, but you're basically born with it. That's been difficult enough to measure and make sense of. But these other systems are mostly dynamic systems. They're changing all the time. So I'm curious about where we are with taking genomics and adding these other omics and how useful that is right now. I don't know who wants to.
Well, maybe I can start. I think this is perfect example when the pregnancy is not only genomics, and not only genomics of the baby, but this is the combination of the parental, and not only mom, but the father's genome contributing to fetal development, but also maternal genome and the metabolomics, omics, is the part how this fetus will be developing and how pregnancy will be progressing. So there is definitely some of the metabolomic markers, omic markers, that would have a great prediction, probably preeclampsia, some of the miscarriages, or the incompatibility between the maternal and the fetal genome. So incorporation and integration of this data is definitely one of the goals, and there are efforts going on really monitoring or investigating the fetal and maternal metabolomics during the pregnancy to really get inside of this process and use this as a guidance for the pregnancy management. We heard yesterday about the application that would be launched for the pregnancy monitoring. And that's, again, incorporation of the genomics data and metabolomics data that may be obtained can be really predictive tools and used on that. And so this would be obviously helpful for the clinicians and families. So that's one of the applications of the.
No, it's fascinating, and the work is moving quickly. Nathan, maybe.
Sure. So one of the really fascinating things, if you take genetics and you interface it with multiomics, is that genetics gives you a rubric to understand a lot of what's happening in the multiomics. And I'll give you an example. So we published a paper in PNAS last year, and one of the things we did is we took the polygenic risk score for every disease that has a high quality one that's been published. So by our criteria, we thought 54 of them had good signals. And what you can do is you can go into a population that is without disease. But you know that based on this genetic signature, that some of the individuals in there are much more likely to get the disease than others. So it gives you a really interesting new path to start thinking about what prevention or the earliest stages of disease look like. Because that genetic variant does not mean anything in a test tube, right? It means something in your body. And it's having an effect. And if you measure all these multiomics, you can then just ask simple questions. What is the effect that this genome has decades before individuals get disease? And you don't know for any one person that they're going to go on and get Alzheimer's or whatever, but you know that those buckets, that's the group that's getting it higher. And when we applied this, you find out a bunch of really interesting things. For example, ALS. It turns out that in the blood of people that don't have ALS but are just at higher genetic risk for ALS, there are signs that you end up with higher amounts of heavy metals. Now, there's no reason to believe that in a random population, that's unhealthy, that doesn't have the disease, that they're more exposed. Could be, but the straightforward interpretation is that people who are at high genetic risk, in fact, are not as good at clearing those. And those heavy metals are known to be a risk factor for ALS, but that was always associated with environment. Well, it turns out that the genetics is probably important too. Another interesting one on ALS is that they have unusually high levels of omega-3s in their blood. That's controversial because we tend to think of omega-3s as good. But there's also mouse model experiments of ALS mouse model that shows that if you give them omega-3s, their ALS symptoms accelerate rather than decelerate. So you can dive in on, and you go down a rabbit hole on that particular question, but there's all these kinds of things. Coronary artery disease. The only protein of the 300 we looked at that is correlated with differential genetics in asymptomatic individuals for coronary artery disease is PCSK9, which is the biggest blockbuster drug that's come out recently on that, and on and on and on. And so you can really use genetics as a way to unlock all this potential because you don't have to wait to do a case control on disease. It gives you a view into what might be happening very early on.
Yeah, I'll just add on to, I think it's always part of the equation, and I think our goal was to explain as much of the risk and as much of the variability as we can. So coming back to medication example again, we can predict a certain outcome from genomics, but then we can completely modify it through something as simple as a drug interaction. I could have 3 copies of CYP2D6, and on my genetic test report, maybe the one pager that came back from Robert will say, I need more of X medication. But an astute pharmacist will say, well, wait a minute, you're taking a very strong inhibitor that's blocking all of that enzyme. So if we increase the dose, it's actually the exact opposite thing we have to do. So I think it's genetics plus all the clinical factors, which I think we all know. But then specifically to omics and other technologies, think about all the situations, and maybe depression again, right? Why do we have to wait 6 weeks? Why don't we wait? There's got to be a signal, of the drug changing a trajectory of response, something in the metabolome that's changing. And I think it'll change the way we do drug developments. It'll change the way we treat patients by understanding early trajectories that are even supported by the genetic signatures up front, or that are aberrant to those signatures that'll help us sort of piece the complex picture together. So I see it as a useful tool, but I also sort of are a little bit realistic that we're not even good at doing decision support linking genomics with clinical risk factors. We have to understand how to do PRS a lot more. I hope it's faster, but we have a ways to go for some of that to get into mainline clinical practice.
No, I appreciate that. And when I say I miss Aerovol, it was one of the few companies that tried to commercially and from a consumer standpoint put together multiomics. And it was even more than that. I mean, they did some classic sort of blood chemistry tests and medical tests. But it was interesting, and they also, a critical factor on this is explaining it. And you guys are all really, really good at explaining it. And I don't mean to sell Aerovols. That's unfortunately
It's gone, yeah.
Yeah, I know. But I
too
did.
late.
I tried. I tried. I
You
talked
did.
about it
I
a lot.
appreciate
And it
it.
wasn't that I, being paid under the table or anything. I really did admire what they were doing. And one of the nicest things they did, which we haven't talked about here, but it's important to remember, they had a human interface. About every month or so, I got a call from a nurse. And my nurse's name was Ginger, and I really missed Ginger, because Ginger would explain these results. But it wasn't just the genomics, it wasn't just one or two factors, it was trying to piece all of this together in a way that actually made sense to me, in terms of diet and my lifestyle. And we have to keep in mind that all of these, it's a very complex situation. And we're reaching, by the way, if people have questions either online or want to step up to one of the mics, that would be great. We'll do that in just a moment here. But I did want to maybe just ask you all in a line or two to talk about how we turn this corner, and what resistance factor, if you could get rid of it right now, what would that be to making this world we're talking about happen? Robert?
Well, I think that, I come from a public health tradition where you just got to have the evidence. And it's necessary but not sufficient. And so one of my basic slides is to lay audiences is science and storytelling. And they form this Venn diagram. If you do storytelling alone, it's marketing. And at its worst, it's manipulation. If you do science alone and you don't make it relevant, and you don't get the word out, and you don't show people the lives that have been affected. So we've been making these 2-minute videos of people in our biobank who discovered unanticipated findings. I speak at things like this and many others, as you know. I know Nathan and Phil speak a lot at all these different things, both scientific and public facing. So I don't know. I don't really have a magic bullet to do this. I think that industry is going to push things forward, but it'll be a kind of 3 steps forward, 1 step back for when they overstep and promise too much or deliver too little. So it's a messy business. I don't know. I'd be curious what the...
No, I'm actually, keep that question, and maybe we can slip it in, because we only have a few minutes left, and we do have some people here live anyway. I don't know about online, but why don't we start?
Thank you very much. This was a really superb discussion. Thank you very much, David, for assembling this. I wanted to ask on one of your previous questions, and Nathan's comment about using the genomics as a kind of building block and putting all the other omics on top of that. Is that just an issue of convenience? In other words, we've had the genomic studies for a long time, we're more used to them, and it's easier for us to use it as a foundation and to build other omics on top of it. From the methodology point of view, if we had more information about the microbiome, for example, would you be able to say the same thing? We'll use the microbiome as our building block and then add the genomic, epigenomic on top of it? Will that change our answers?
Yeah, so I'm certainly happy to talk about that. I think it's still different, because I think the genome as a building block makes a lot of sense because it is static. You have it, you know it, and the reason that it's so useful for looking into trying to peer into this pre-disease early issue is because it is the same then as it's going to be later and so forth. You can absolutely integrate the other kinds of data. Microbiome, for example, right? So we showed in a Nature Biotech paper from 2 years ago that you could predict the alpha diversity of the microbiome from the metabolome, right? And we also showed in a Nature Metabolism paper this year that you could track aging with the microbiome, for example. So and that you would get these divergent microbiomes, but a consistent metabolome from these divergent microbiomes if people stayed healthy as they got older and so forth. So I think there's kind of a couple points to your question. So one is, I don't think that these movable or changeable omics operate quite the same as like a foundation in some of the ways you can use the genome, but obviously for integration you can go in all different directions.
Let's go jump to another question. Bob?
Yes, David, actually, your experience with getting sequenced 20 years ago brings my question up for Robert, which is you have a cross-section of time when you do deep sequencing on a newborn. And then, as we've talked about, that company that did that sequencing may or may not be here. The newborn may live into their 90s, hopefully. Many of the initial issues that drove that sequencing and the initial actions will be long forgotten. Who owns the newborn sequencing, and how can it be maintained and remined effectively when more data is available?
I'd like to add one more element to that, which is who controls that data in the future.
Exactly.
Yes.
Well, I think the human being owns their data, and they can lend it or give it, share it with whoever they wish to. And part of the suspiciousness has been, of course, I think that is implied in your question, is that companies haven't been forthright about taking these data and, they're going to use it, they're going to monetize it, they're going to sell it. And I think that, so that's part of your question, I believe. And then the other part, just mechanically, is I think that there will be an opportunity to take the electronic sequence and other omics and then refer to them, reinterrogate them upon demand. But, every 3, 4, 5 years, sequencing technology and these other omics technologies are going to improve, and they're going to get cheaper and faster.
Right.
So at some point, it'll just be just as cheap and just as fast to just get another drop of blood and resequence yourself and reinterpret. But you're right, the whole reinterpretation and updating conundrum is a hard one. We do not have a solution to that yet.
Okay. Let's jump to another question over here.
Interesting that you're sequencing babies. From my perspective, I'd be sequencing cell-free DNA from embryos prior to selection for implantation. Add-ons for IVF programs are proliferating all over the place. And with a nanopore full genome sequence of less than $800, this is going to become routine. Tough decisions made.
I think there's a market. I think there's a market there.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Did you have a question or?
No, just
okay, thank you.
Get the thoughts, because there's going to be many variants of unknown significance, and in terms of instructing the parents of this future embryo into child, which to transfer, which not to.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? But you could rank those embryos. You don't actually have to be truly accurate about VUSs or even structural variants. You could just rank the embryos and say, I think these 3 have the fewest suspicious things, and then wouldn't that be a service?
Yeah. We have another question. I did want to ask a question though that I think is important before we end, given where we are in 2021, about COVID and genetics. Well, the genetics of COVID is ridiculously simple as a virus, or the virus that causes COVID. But Robert, and I think some of you all may also be involved. You've been involved in some of these global consortiums trying to work out the genetics of humans. And I mean, I heard a story on NPR this morning, where I used to work, about COVID long haul, and they were saying it seems to be different in almost every single person. The reactions, the symptoms, how it lingers, how it goes away. Has the pandemic been an opportunity to try to better understand the genetics of something like COVID, which is obviously an environmental impact, which we haven't talked much about here, but obviously a lot of our genetics has been adapted over eons to react to environmental perturbations. But have we learned, has that pushed us forward in genomics and preventive genomics, or even interpretive genomics? Anybody want to jump in?
I'll just jump in and say, David, that I don't think this is the question you're asking, but this galvanized the physician scientist workforce and everybody in research in a way I've never experienced in 37 years of being an academic. And I'm part of a 3,000 author paper that reported on genetic vulnerability to severe COVID. And people worked together in new ways. People found shortcuts. There's been a lot of attention to the frontline healthcare workers who took care of patients, as there should be. But I just think many in the audience may not realize how incredible the research community galvanized, and everybody associated, the IRBs, the grants officers. It's just been an amazing, we hear all about anti-science in the news, but it's just been, I've never been more proud of being part of science too.
Yeah, and Robert was generous enough to participate in an article I wrote last year for Vanity Fair on this very topic. How literally in a few days, all the biobanks in the world combined based on a couple tweets that actually came out of Finland. And it was amazing. Still working, and these are obviously the kind of efforts that will push us forward. So one more quick question?
Yes, so following up on the question about the who control the data. So since now we're like 2021 now, what's your thought on, tokenize all those genomics data that like Bitcoin, George Church is trying to do the NFT for genomics data. Because to me that if you think the patient owns the data, if somebody sell those data to some pharmaceutical companies, they should get paid. And then there will be like, incentive for those patients to do more, to participate in more large-scale genomic research. Otherwise, if I'm going to pay $1,000 to get a sequence while somebody's going to sell my data to someone else and make money out of it and I got zero, what's the incentive for the participant?
Such a fascinating question.
Sure. Well, I would just say technologically, I agree. I think NFTs are probably the only way we have right now to really enforce this. Because as you think about the cost of sequencing coming down, it is going to be so trivial. You leave copies of your genome on every seat you sit on, right? On every glass of water you take. So as sequencing becomes really, truly ubiquitous, the fact of obtaining a genome is going to be nothing. And so you have to have a marker that lives in the digital world that ascribes that very specifically to you, which your genome does, but you can have tokens for that, and then you can actually monitor how it's used in those spaces. So I do think that's, because on our current internet, we probably can't really control it terribly well.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think it's also about the traceability of the knowledge around it. So if I'm receiving data from someone or receiving a recommendation from someone, I think, currently those are handed off in paper, unfortunately, the majority of the time still. If we knew where that data came from, where it was sequenced, the quality of that sequencing, where the recommendations were sourced from, it would help us all connect more and collaborate more, especially in the clinical space. So I think these technologies, whether it's NFT, whether it's blockchain, these things can help us understand verifiable sources.
And there is one company that I have no relationship with, but Luna DNA is actually trying to collect people's DNA and give them something back in return for it being used in research.
Yeah, and we've gone over here a little bit, so we better stop. But this is such a huge question in our society right now. Who owns the data? And my friend Jaron Lanier, who invented one of the inventors of virtual reality, has been all over the place about every time somebody uses a piece of data, whatever it is, you should get, a fraction of a cent. We could think of different systems, NFTs, whatever. But this seems to be a fabulous, huge question right now. And in a lot of ways, the IT data that people are all upset about right now is a dress rehearsal for the health data, which is actually far more important because that has to do with our health and our lives and our children and our families. But anyway, apologize for going a little over to the organizers here, but I think it's a fascinating discussion. And let's say thank you to our panel.